The first thing I noticed on Christmas Eve was not the ocean. It was the silence of my own phone sitting face up on the porch railing, dark and still at exactly 4:59 in the afternoon. 1 minute before the whole world I had spent 40 years building for my children was scheduled to come apart in their hands instead of mine. I had a glass of sweet tea, sweating a ring onto the wooden rail. I had bare feet resting on a rattan ottoman. I had the kind of Gulf Coast breeze that smells like salt and distant rain, drifting in off water the color of jade glass. And I had, for the first time in longer than I could remember, absolutely nothing pressing on my chest. Then the clock on the screen rolled over to 5 o'clock, and the phone came alive like something had been struck. It buzzed once, hard, skittering an inch across the railing. Then again. Then it did not stop. Message after message stacked up on the lock screen faster than I could have read them even if I had wanted to, which I did not yet. I let it shake itself nearly off the edge of the porch while I took a slow sip of tea and watched a pelican fold its wings and drop out of the sky into the water like a stone. My son Derek's name came up first. The room key isn't working. They're saying the account's frozen. Call the front desk right now. Then my daughter Melissa. Dad, answer your phone. Craig's card just got declined at dinner in front of the whole restaurant. What did you do? Then my daughter-in-law. Susan, we are literally standing at the front desk and they're threatening to call mountain police. This is insane. Fix this. I did not pick it up. I did not even lean over to look closer. I sat exactly where I was and let the porch fill with the low buzzing hum of 4 grown adults, discovering all at once, 3,000 miles away in the mountains of Wyoming, that the safety net they had never once thanked me for was gone. You have to understand something about my family before you can understand why I was smiling on that porch instead of panicking. 8 years ago, right around the time my wife Eleanor's heart finally gave out, after a long, quiet illness she never once complained about, my children stopped seeing me as their father and started seeing me as an account number with a pulse attached to it. It did not happen overnight. It crept in slowly, the way water gets into a foundation, until one day you realize the whole structure is standing on rock. If you're watching this and you have ever poured your whole life into people who only remembered your name when they needed something from you, tell me where you're tuning in from down in the comments. And hit that subscribe button, because by the end of tonight you're going to understand exactly why I let my children fly first class into a trap I built with my own 2 hands. Let me take you back to Thanksgiving. 4 weeks before that phone started shaking itself apart on my porch railing. That was the night the illusion finally cracked wide open, though it took me a little while to admit what I was looking at. I hosted that dinner in the same house I had lived in for 31 years, a modest brick colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac outside of Charleston, the same house where Eleanor and I raised Derek and Melissa on casseroles and library cards and second-hand bicycles, back before the freight company I built, out of a single rusted-out delivery truck, turned into something with my name stamped on 40 terminals across the Southeast. I sold Hastings Freight Lines 11 years ago for a number that still doesn't feel real to me some mornings. Eleanor and I made a choice back then, together, at our kitchen table, that we were going to keep living exactly the way we always had. Same modest house, same 10-year-old truck in the driveway, same coupons clipped out of the Sunday paper. We didn't want our children growing up soft. We wanted them to know the weight of a dollar earned with their own hands. I understand now, sitting on that porch with the tea sweating onto the rail, that Eleanor and I got exactly one thing backward. We thought hiding the money would protect them from becoming entitled. Instead, our silence just gave them a blank canvas to paint whatever story about me they wanted, and the story they landed on was that their father was a cheap, small-minded old man sitting on a modest nest egg, who owed them a debt for every year I'd made them live within their means. That Thanksgiving I'd hired a proper catering outfit out of downtown Charleston, because my daughter Melissa had informed me a year earlier that she couldn't in good conscience eat what she called my processed, working-class cooking anymore. I spent close to $1,100 making sure that table had her free-range turkey and imported cheeses and some kind of orange wine she'd specifically requested. The moment she walked through my front door, she wrinkled her nose at the thermostat and turned it down 4 degrees without asking, the way she does every single year, like she's still 17 years old, and this is still her house. Her husband Craig took one look at the wine I'd already poured for him and set the glass down on my counter hard enough that I heard the crystal clink against the granite. "This is a little sharp, Walter," he said, like he was doing me a favor by drinking it at all. I'd paid $72 a bottle. I poured him something else without a word. Across the table, my son Derek spent 20 minutes of that dinner talking with his mouth half full about a lakefront duplex flip his company had supposedly just closed, bragging about margins and comps and a word he loved to throw around, portfolio, like he was some kind of self-made real estate tycoon at 38 years old. I sat there nodding along, because I already knew, though he had no idea that I knew, that Hastings Premier Developments hadn't turned an honest profit in 3 straight years, and that the only reason his lights were still on was a shell company I quietly controlled called Meridian Capital Partners, wiring him just enough capital every single month to keep his fantasy afloat. His wife Susan chimed in about how they were thinking of finally hiring a property manager so Derek could focus on strategy instead of the grunt work. I chewed my green beans and said nothing, because the grunt work, as far as I could tell, was mostly golf. When the plates were finally cleared, Derek stood up at the head of my own dining table, my table, not his, and clapped his hands together like he was calling a meeting to order. "Big family news," he announced. "We found the spot for Christmas this year. The Alpine Crown up in Jackson Hole. Private hot tub on every suite, ski in, ski out. They'll even fly in a private chef for Christmas dinner if we want it." He grinned around at everyone like he'd just handed us all a winning lottery ticket. "It's about $32,000 for the week, all in. Dad, you'll grab the deposit like always, right? We'll figure out the rest once we're up there. $32,000 for 1 week. I set my fork down gently. "That's a significant amount of money, son," I said, keeping my voice mild. "Your company's had a rough couple of years from what you've told me. Maybe this year we look at something a little more modest. A cabin up in the Smokies, closer to home, a fraction of the cost." My daughter's hand hit the table hard enough to rattle the water glasses. "Unbelievable," Melissa said, rolling her eyes so hard I half expected them to stay that way. "Every single year, Dad. Every year you turn Christmas into a lecture about money. You have more than you could ever spend, and you sit on it like it's some kind of religion. We just want one nice week together, as a family." Craig leaned back in his chair with the particular smugness of a man who has never once had to explain a bounced check. "Come on, Walter. You can't take it with you. Don't be the Grinch. Just write the check." I looked around that table at 4 healthy, capable adults in their 30s and 40s, glaring at me like I was a child refusing to share a toy, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as bone-deep exhaustion. I raised my hands in mock surrender and forced a smile onto my face. "All right," I said quietly. "Let me look at the numbers." They cheered. They actually cheered, raising their glasses of orange wine to toast themselves, and then went right back to ignoring me for the rest of the evening, exactly the way they always did. About an hour later, the house had gone quiet. The kids had drifted into the living room to watch football, leaving me alone in the kitchen with a sink full of catering trays and a heart full of something heavier than dish soap could ever cut through. That's when I noticed the family iPad sitting on the counter, plugged into the wall where it always lived. The one we all shared for grocery lists and the neighborhood watch app and photos from Sophie's birthday party down the street. The screen had lit up on its own with a notification, and out of nothing more than old habit. I'd used that tablet to check the weather that very morning. I reached over and tapped it awake to silence the buzzing. It didn't open to the weather. It opened straight into a shared notes document, one that had apparently been left unlocked and running in the background for days. The title at the top of the page stopped my hand cold on the counter. Operation Sunset. I should have closed it right there. I have told myself that 100 times since. But my eyes had already caught the first line, and once you've read the first line of something like that, there is no version of you strong enough to look away, Craig. Keep buttering him up through the trip. Let him feel like the big generous provider one more time. We pushed the trust paperwork the second week of January. Before he can talk to that lawyer of his, my chest went tight. I kept reading Susan. Once the trust's signed and Derek and Melissa are named trustees, we start the assisted living conversation. Sunny Pines has a 2-bedroom opening in March. He'll fight it at first, but he'll come around once he sees the brochure. Big house is too much for one old man rattling around alone anyway, Derek agreed. Once we control the trust, we sell the house, pay off the flip company debt, clear my line of credit, and split whatever's left. He gets a nice little apartment and round-the-clock help. Everybody wins. Melissa, he's going to be so much happier somewhere, he doesn't have to take care of himself. This is honestly the loving thing to do. The screen went dark on its own before I could read any further, timed out from sitting idle too long, and I stood there in my own kitchen staring at my warped reflection in the black glass. My hands braced on the edge of the counter like the floor had tilted beneath me. 71 years of building something with my bare hands, and my own children had reduced me, in writing, to a line item they were managing. Not a father. An asset with a shrinking shelf life. I did not storm into the living room. I did not throw anyone out into the cold. Something in me went very still and very cold instead, the way the ocean goes glassy right before a squall rolls in. I wiped down the counter, dried my hands on the dish towel, and walked into the living room like nothing at all had happened, and told my son I'd been thinking it over, and that yes, we'd do the Alpine Crown for Christmas. You should have seen how fast their whole mood shifted. Derek clapped me on the shoulder and called me the best dad in the world. Melissa actually hugged me, a stiff, hollow little hug, but a hug all the same. I hugged her back and smiled and felt absolutely nothing, because I already knew, standing right there in my own living room with my daughter's arms around me, that I was going to give every single one of them exactly what they had asked for. I was simply going to choose the moment it arrived. The next morning I woke before dawn, the way I used to when I was still driving that first battered delivery truck cross-country on nothing but black coffee and stubbornness. I put on a suit my children had never once seen me wear. They thought I lived in flannel and work boots, because that was the character Eleanor and I had built for their benefit. And I drove my old pickup into downtown Charleston, into a glass tower, where the valet gave my truck a strange look right up until I handed him $100 bill. Warren Whitfield had managed my finances quietly for almost 15 years, ever since the sale of the company, and he was one of maybe 4 people on this earth who actually knew what I was worth. He stood up from behind his desk the moment I walked in, surprised to see me outside of tax season. "Walter," he said, "what's going on?" "I need to cut every financial tie I have to my children," I told him, sitting down across from his desk without any preamble at all. "Every single one, and I need you to help me time it." Warren sat back down slowly, steepling his fingers, studying my face the way a good doctor studies a patient who's just walked in looking far too calm for whatever news they're about to deliver. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start from the beginning." So I did. I told him about the shared iPad. I told him about Operation Sunset, word for word, as much as I could remember of it, and I watched a lifetime of professional composure drain slowly out of his face while I spoke. When I finally finished, he closed his laptop halfway and looked at me the way you look at someone who's just been in an accident. "Walter, that's not just cold," he said quietly. "That's a coordinated plan to defraud you of your assets and your independence. We could involve the authorities today, restraining orders, a formal competency evaluation on your terms to shut this down before it starts. No police," I said, "no courtroom. That's what a frightened old man would do. And I am not a frightened old man. I built the thing they're trying to steal from me with my bare hands, and I'm going to be the one who decides how it ends. Pull up every account. I want to see exactly how deep I've been bleeding for them." He turned the monitor toward me, and for the next 2 hours we went line by line through a decade of quiet subsidies that even I had lost full track of. Over 3 years, Meridian Capital had fed $181,000 into Derek's flip company, disguised as anonymous angel investment, just so my son could keep playing the role of a self-made developer at Thanksgiving dinner. Melissa and Craig's lakefront mortgage, the one on the house they'd bought 2 years earlier and absolutely could not have qualified for on their own, was propped up by a standing collateral pledge from my own portfolio, plus a silent monthly transfer of $3,500 that covered the gap between what they earned and what they'd promised the bank they could pay. They think they're self-sufficient, I said, staring at the numbers. They genuinely believe their whole lifestyle is something they built. Because you never once let them feel the floor drop out, Warren said. You caught them every single time, so quietly they never even felt themselves falling. I told him what I wanted done. Every bridge loan into Derek's company halted, my guarantee on Melissa and Craig's mortgage formally withdrawn. Every credit line I'd extended, frozen at the source. But not today, not this week. I wanted it timed, all of it, to detonate at once, on a date and a minute of my own choosing. When? Warren asked. The final balance on that ski lodge comes due December 24th, I said. I want every account, every card, every loan to go dark at exactly 5 o'clock that afternoon, Christmas Eve, the exact hour they expect me to be their generous, foolish father one last time. Warren studied me for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. The way a man nods when he's decided to trust the person across the desk, even though what they're asking for troubles him. I'll have the orders ready, he said. What are you going to do until then? I stood up and buttoned my jacket. I'm going to go home, I said, and be exactly the naive old man they think I already am. I played my part flawlessly for the next 2 weeks, and the strangest thing about it was how easy it turned out to be. I had spent 7 decades being underestimated by strangers who took one look at my flannel shirts and my old truck and decided I wasn't worth a second glance. Underestimating me had always come naturally to my children, too. I simply had to lean into it a little harder than usual. I handed Derek and Melissa each one of my black corporate cards on the first Sunday of December, told them to go ahead and book whatever they wanted for Jackson Hole, and watched their faces light up with something that looked almost like affection. Except I knew by then it was closer to relief. What they didn't know was that Warren had already placed a soft temporary ceiling on those specific accounts. Enough clearance to book deposits and reservations and make the whole trip feel real, but every dollar of it tied to an account, scheduled to go dark the moment the final balances tried to settle. I didn't need to be in the room to know how their planning session went that night. I could picture it well enough from the notifications alone. A pending charge from a private aviation concierge. Derek had upgraded all 4 adult tickets to a chartered flight out of Charleston, because commercial first class apparently wasn't good enough anymore for a man who told strangers he ran a real estate empire. A charge from a boutique downtown for $11,000 in ski apparel, imported parkas and hand-stitched gloves, because Melissa and Susan had decided the trip required an entirely new wardrobe worthy of the photographs they intended to post. A rental agreement for 2 fully loaded luxury SUVs waiting for them at the Jackson Hole airport, courtesy of Craig, who liked to arrive places the way he liked to leave them, loudly, and on somebody else's dime. I want to tell you about the 2 weeks in between, though, because that's where the story most people never get to see. That's where I almost lost my nerve. My oldest friend in the world is a man named Frank Delgado, a retired Charleston police detective who moved on to my cul-de-sac the same year Eleanor and I did, 31 years ago, back when our children were still small enough to ride bicycles up and down that quiet street together every summer evening. Frank had been at Eleanor's funeral. Frank had sat with me on this same porch more nights than I could count in the years since, usually without saying much of anything, which is exactly the kind of company a grieving man actually needs. Frank has a granddaughter named Sophie, 8 years old, who has taken to calling me Grandpa Walter since she was about 4, mostly because her own grandmother passed before she was born, and she decided somewhere along the way that I would do just fine as a substitute. Sophie shows up on my porch most Saturday mornings with a plate of something her mother baked, usually lopsided cookies with far too much frosting, and she sits with me and tells me long, meandering stories about her classroom hamster while I pretend to be far more invested in the hamster's welfare than any reasonable adult has any business being. The Saturday after I found Operation Sunset, Sophie showed up with her cookies as usual, and I must not have hidden what I was carrying inside me nearly as well as I thought, because halfway through a story about the hamster escaping its cage, she stopped talking and looked at me with the kind of unguarded directness only a child that age can manage. "You look sad, Grandpa Walter," she said. "Did somebody take something of yours?" I looked at her for a long moment before I answered. "Something like that, sweetheart," I said. "Well," she said, "matter of fact as anything. Did you tell them to give it back?" I laughed, the first real laugh I'd managed in days, and told her I was working on it. She seemed satisfied with that answer and went right back to the hamster. Frank came by that same evening after Sophie had gone home, carrying 2 beers and the particular expression of a man who spent 30 years learning to read faces for a living. He sat down in the chair across from mine, handed me a bottle, and said, "You've had something eating at you for 2 weeks. Walt, I've been letting you sit with it because that's usually what you need, but I'm asking now." So I told him, all of it, Operation Sunset, the trust, the assisted living brochure they already had picked out, the plan to sell my house out from under me the moment they had legal control. Frank didn't say a word until I finished, and when I did, he set his beer down on the porch rail hard enough that I heard the glass tap the wood. "Walter," he said, "in 28 years on the force, I put people away for less than what your kids are cooking up on paper. That's elder financial abuse, plain and simple, whether or not they ever get the deed signed. You want me to make a call?" "I still know people, no police," I said, the same thing I'd told Warren. "Not yet. I want them to understand what they did, Frank, not just get punished for it. There's a difference." Frank was quiet for a while, turning his beer bottle slowly in his hands, looking out at the dark yard. "You know," he finally said, "the hardest cases I ever worked weren't the ones where somebody was pure evil. Those are almost easy, in a strange way. The hard ones were the ones where I could see exactly how somebody talked themselves into believing what they were doing was justified." He glanced at me. "Doesn't make it right, but it might help you understand it, if that's worth anything to you." I thought about that a great deal over the following days, more than I expected to. I thought about Derek at 7 years old, the year before the freight company finally turned its first real profit, when Eleanor and I came within 1 bad month of losing this very house. I had worked 18-hour doubles that whole winter, and Derek had watched his mother cry quietly over the kitchen bills more than once, thinking neither of us noticed him standing in the hallway. He had never once brought it up as an adult. But I began to understand, sitting on that porch turning the memory over, that my son had spent his entire life terrified of ever standing that close to the edge again, and that the fear had curdled somewhere along the way into an entitlement that let him justify almost anything. It didn't excuse a single word of what he'd written in that document. But Frank was right. It helped me see the shape of it. Melissa's reasons, I suspected, ran differently. Craig's father had gone through a very public bankruptcy when Craig was in college, the kind of thing that follows a family through a small town for years, and Craig had built his entire adult identity on making sure nobody ever looked at him and saw that shame again. Melissa had married into that fear, and somewhere along the way she had adopted it as her own. None of that changed what I did next. It only changed how I felt while I was doing it. 2 weeks before the Christmas trip, I was in my study going through an old cedar chest I hadn't opened in years, looking for a fishing reel Frank wanted to borrow, when I found the brass compass instead. It had been sitting in that chest since before I'd even sold the company. The same compass I'd kept mounted on the dashboard of my very first delivery truck, back when Hastings Freight Lines was one man, one route, and a prayer. Eleanor had given it to me the week we got married, engraved on the back with 3 words, "Find your way home." I set it on my desk and stared at it for a long while. Beside it in that same chest was a leather ledger, cracked and soft with age, filled with my own cramped handwriting recording every single delivery I'd made in that first brutal year, every mile driven, every dollar earned, down to the penny. Derek had found that ledger once as a teenager, flipped through a few pages, called it old man junk, and tossed it back in the drawer without a second thought. I picked it up now and ran my thumb along the worn spine and thought about how strange it was that the boy who once called this junk had spent the last 3 years living entirely off money that traced its origins straight back to these very pages. 2 weeks before Christmas, my children showed up at my front door unannounced, and I knew the moment I saw the third man climbing out of the back seat of Craig's rental car that Operation Sunset had moved into its next phase early. He introduced himself as Gary Pruitt, an estate specialist, wearing a cheap gray suit that didn't sit right across his shoulders and carrying a battered leather briefcase that smelled faintly of the stale coffee shop where I imagined he'd waited before this appointment. Derek did the talking. He told me they'd found an urgent, completely legal way to protect the house from a wave of new estate tax changes, supposedly coming in January, and that Mr. Pruitt just needed a signature or two today to lock in the protection before the window closed. Gary Pruitt slid a thick stack of documents across my coffee table, each signature line marked with a little yellow sticky flag, and handed me a heavy pen. He talked in soft, reassuring circles about probate exposure and irrevocable trusts and government overreach, sliding smoothly past the one detail that actually mattered, that the trust structure he was describing would hand full legal control of my home to Derek and Melissa as trustees, effective the moment my signature hit that page. I already knew every word of what he was trying to sell me. I'd read it in their own handwriting 2 weeks earlier. I picked up the pen and let my hand tremble, just slightly, the way I imagined a tired old man's hand might tremble under pressure. I let the pen slip from my fingers and clatter against the glass table, and I let out a small, defeated laugh, rubbing my wrist like it ached. "I'm sorry, boys," I murmured. "My arthritis has been acting up something fierce with the cold. All this paperwork, it's a lot to take in on a Tuesday." Craig stepped forward at once, trying to hand the pen back to me with the patient, condescending tone people use on the very old or the very young. "Walter, it's simple. You really don't have to understand every word. That's what we pay Gary for." I shook my head slowly and told them the house held too many memories to sign away without sitting with it a little longer, and that all I wanted, more than anything, was to enjoy this Christmas trip without a dark cloud hanging over it. I told them I promised, I gave them my actual word, that when we got back from Jackson Hole in January, we would sit down together and I would sign whatever needed signing. I watched Derek and Craig trade a look, weighing whether to push harder or let it go, and I watched greed win out over urgency, exactly the way I'd counted on it to. A frightened old man who promised to sign in January was far easier to manage than a suspicious old man who might call his own attorney today. Derek clapped Gary Pruitt on the shoulder and told him to pack up, that we'd reconvene the first week of the new year. They said their goodbyes like the perfect, patient, loving children, and I listened to their car pull away down my quiet street, and the moment the sound faded, the trembling in my hand disappeared like it had never existed at all. The credit card charges started arriving the very next morning, and they never really stopped. $11,000 for the ski apparel, $6,000 for the chartered flight upgrades, rental agreements for the 2 luxury SUVs, complete with premium winter packages and concierge airport delivery, a $4,000 deposit at a spa inside the lodge itself, booked a full week before they even arrived, because Melissa had decided they all deserved to be pampered before a single ski boot touched snow. I sat at my kitchen counter each morning with a cup of the cheapest coffee I owned and watched the numbers climb, feeling nothing that resembled anger anymore. Only a steady, quiet clarity. The same kind of clarity, I imagine, a surgeon feels the night before a difficult operation. 3 days before Christmas, I called a commercial developer named Ray Holloway, a man who had been trying to buy my double lot for almost 6 years, wanting to tear the old colonial down and put up 2 modern builds in its place. I had always turned him down before, out of loyalty to Eleanor's garden and 31 years of memory soaked into the walls. This time I invited him over, told him I wanted a cash offer with a 10-day close and no contingencies, and told him I'd leave every stick of furniture behind. He offered me a little under market value in exchange for speed, and I didn't care, because I wasn't chasing the highest number anymore. I was chasing finality. I signed the deed at my own dining room table, the same table where Derek had announced his ski trip 4 weeks earlier, and wired the proceeds straight into an irrevocable trust of my own that Warren had built specifically so that no court, no trustee, and no grieving performance of a manipulated old man could ever touch it again. Then I went upstairs and packed one small suitcase. Not the heavy wool coat I usually wore for winter travel. I wasn't going anywhere cold. 5 light linen shirts, a pair of comfortable shoes, my leather toiletry kit, Eleanor's brass compass wrapped carefully in a soft undershirt so the glass wouldn't crack, and tucked into the side pocket a small wooden box I hadn't opened in years, filled with every Christmas card Eleanor had ever written our children by hand, one for each year, right up until the winter she passed. I walked through that house one final time before I locked the door. I looked at the sofa where Melissa had rolled her eyes at my thermostat for 30 years running. I looked at the dining table, where Derek had announced my exclusion from a trip he still fully intended to make me pay for. I left the fine china behind. I left the good silver behind. I found I did not mind at all the thought of a demolition crew hauling it all to a dumpster because it was easier, somehow, than imagining my children fighting over it once I was gone. I dropped the front door key into a prepaid envelope addressed to Ray Holloway and mailed it from the box at the end of my own driveway. A car service arrived right on schedule, and as it pulled away from the curb, I watched my quiet street disappear in the side mirror and felt, for the first time in longer than I could name, something close to peace. At the airport, my children were already 3 gates over, boarding a chartered flight bound for Jackson Hole, toasting themselves with champagne they believed I was paying for. I walked in the opposite direction entirely, past the mountain gates, toward a small regional flight bound for the Gulf Coast of Florida, to a quiet stretch of beach on Sanibel Island where I had booked myself one modest room, with a view of the water, and absolutely nothing else waiting for me there but silence. By the time my children checked into the Alpine Crown Lodge that evening, laughing in the grand timber-framed lobby, requesting their master suite upgrade, on a card I already knew had a hard countdown ticking on it, I was 3,000 miles away with my bare feet in warm sand, watching a Gulf sunset bleed orange and violet across the water, waiting for the same clock they hadn't yet learned to fear. 2 weeks passed in something close to silence between us, and I let every single charge clear without a word of protest. Champagne towers and seafood platters delivered to their suite. Spa treatments for Melissa and Susan that ran well past $1,000 each. Bourbon at $40 a glass in a members-only lounge overlooking the slopes, where Derek and Craig sat by the fire dividing up my remaining fortune in their heads before I had ever handed $1 of it over. I watched every notification arrive on my phone, and every single one only confirmed what I already knew. They weren't spending my money anymore. They were spending time. On the afternoon of December 24th, I sat on my rented porch on Sanibel with a glass of sweet tea sweating onto the rail, and I watched the digital clock on my phone hold steady at 4:59, and I thought, not for the first time, about the brass compass wrapped in an undershirt in my suitcase, and about the words engraved on its back. Find your way home, at 5 o'clock exactly, 3,000 miles away, in Warren Whitfield's quiet office. A single line of code executed a series of orders we had planned for weeks. Corporate cards, revoked. Bridge loans into Derek's company, terminated. My name, stripped permanently from Melissa and Craig's mortgage guarantee. And at the front desk of the Alpine Crown Lodge, a nightly billing system ran its routine evening audit, reached out automatically to capture a final payment of nearly $19,000, and received back, in less than a second, a single flat answer: declined. Account closed. Do not honor. I did not have to be standing in that lobby to know exactly how the color drained from my son's face. My phone had already started buzzing itself across the porch rail before the sun had even finished setting behind the water. I let the phone buzz itself nearly off the porch rail for a good 3 minutes before I finally picked it up, because I wanted a clean, unhurried record in my own memory of exactly what desperation sounded like when it belonged to people who had never once had to feel it before. The first voicemail was from Derek, and underneath the panic in his voice, I could hear the whole scene playing out behind him, a crisp, professional voice explaining to Craig that multiple cards had returned hard decline codes. Guests nearby going quiet the way people do when they sense a public humiliation unfolding a few feet away. And beneath all of it, my daughter-in-law Susan crying somewhere in the background about how they didn't even have money for gas in the rental cars. "Dad," Derek said, his voice cracking on the word, "call the bank. There's some kind of mistake, please." Everyone's staring at us. There was no mistake. I sat on my porch and let a second call go to voicemail, and then a third, and I watched the sun finish sinking below the water in long orange ribbons before I finally reached over, tapped the green button, and accepted a video call from my daughter, Rachel. No, Melissa. Melissa's face filled the screen first, blotchy and streaked with tears, snow falling behind her in fat, silent flakes, her breath fogging in front of her lips. Behind her I could see Derek pacing on the icy sidewalk outside the lodge entrance, and Craig arguing with someone just out of frame, and Susan sitting on top of a pile of designer luggage with her arms wrapped tight around herself. "Dad, where are you?" Melissa's eyes went wide the second the video connected and she saw the warm Gulf light behind me instead of my familiar living room. Where's the couch? Why does it look like, Dad? "We are standing outside in the snow and they called mountain police. Give us a working card right now." Derek shoved his face into the frame, shouldering his sister half out of the shot. "Dad, stop whatever game this is. My business accounts are frozen too. All of it. Everything's at zero. You need to call Whitfield and fix this before we end up arrested." I looked at both of their faces on that small glowing screen, and I felt something I had been bracing for and dreading for 2 solid weeks, and it was not satisfaction. It was grief, clean and sharp. The particular grief of watching 2 people you carried on your shoulders as children finally see themselves clearly for the first time in their adult lives, and hating what they see. "There's no mistake," I said, and I kept my voice level and quiet. "The bank executed exactly what I told them to. Every account is closed. Permanently." "What are you talking about?" Melissa's voice cracked into something close to a scream. "You gave us the cards. You told us to book whatever we wanted." "I did," I said. "I also found the note the 2 of you and Craig and Susan left open on the kitchen tablet the night after Thanksgiving. Operation Sunset. I read every word of it, Melissa. I know about the trust. I know about Sunny Pines. I know you all sat around planning how to sell my house out from under me the moment you had the legal power to do it." The silence on the other end of that call was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. Even through the poor mountain audio, I could hear the wind cut off. Or maybe it was just that everyone standing behind that camera had gone completely still. "Dad," Derek finally said, his voice dropping to a whisper. We were just venting. We were stressed. You can't take that seriously." "I took it very seriously," I said. "So seriously that I decided to give all of you exactly what you asked for. I sold the house 4 days ago. It's already closed. The proceeds are in a trust none of you will ever be able to touch, and I'm not coming back to Charleston. I flew out this morning in the opposite direction of Jackson Hole." Melissa was crying in earnest now, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere much deeper than embarrassment. "Dad, please, the bank already called. They're saying our mortgage is in default. We're going to lose the house. We have nothing." "You never had it, sweetheart," I said, and I let the gentleness stay in my voice even as I said it, because some truths land harder delivered softly. "I was covering $3,500 of your mortgage payment every single month for 2 years. Craig isn't the investment consultant he tells people he is. And Derek, your company hasn't earned an honest dollar in 3 years. The angel investor you always bragged about finding was Meridian Capital. That was me. I built the whole thing you were living inside of, and I just took the walls down." Craig lunged into frame, his face pale under the lodge's exterior lights. "You can't just leave us here. We can't even afford gas to get to the airport." "You're wearing $4,000 of coats you bought on my dime 3 days ago," I said. "I'd start there." Melissa's face crumpled fully then, and for one moment, just one, I saw something in her expression that wasn't panic at all. It was shame, real and raw, the first honest thing I'd seen from any of them in years. "How could you do this to your own family?" she said, quieter now. almost to herself. I didn't destroy anything, I told her. I just stopped funding a lie all four of you were living inside of. You wanted me managed and put away. Well, I'm out of your way now, and so is the money. You own your lives now, all of you. I hope you find something real to build them on. I reached out and ended the call before either of them could answer, and I set the phone face down on the porch rail, and I sat there a long time in the dark, listening to the tide come in, feeling nothing that resembled triumph. Only the strange, hollow quiet that comes after you've finally set down something heavy you carried for far too long. I didn't have to witness the rest of that night to know how it unfolded, because Warren pieced most of it together for me over the following weeks from bank records and a few increasingly frantic calls to his office. Security escorted my children off the lodge property within the hour, their bags already packed and waiting at the service entrance like they were common trespassers. Both rental SUVs sat nearly empty on fuel, and my children spent that Christmas Eve making humiliating, whispered calls to friends and acquaintances back home, begging for small digital transfers just to buy enough gas to start the long drive down the mountain. There was no private chef. There was no champagne by the fire. There was only four exhausted, broken adults crammed into a rented car in the freezing dark, driving away from the version of themselves they had built entirely out of my silence. January was worse for them than Christmas Eve had been, in the way that a slow flood is always worse than a single storm. Without my silent $3,500 subsidy, Melissa and Craig's mortgage went into formal default within 2 weeks, and foreclosure notices started arriving on bright yellow paper that Melissa told me later she couldn't bring herself to open for 3 straight days. Derek's flip company collapsed even faster. Without Meridian Capital's monthly deposits, payroll bounced, his few remaining contractors walked off 2 half-finished properties, and a routine state audit sniffed out just how hollow the whole operation had been all along. He was forced to abandon his leased office in the middle of the night to dodge the property manager. The family group chat, the same digital space where they had once so casually plotted my future, turned into a battlefield of blame. Derek blamed Craig for bringing Gary Pruitt to the house too soon. Craig blamed Susan for leaving the tablet unlocked on the counter. Melissa, from what I understand, mostly went quiet. They tried to come find me once, in the 3rd week of January, driving down together in Craig's rental because Derek's SUV had already been repossessed. I wasn't there to see it, but Warren told me the whole story afterward, because the new owners called his office in a panic after 4 strangers showed up demanding to know where I'd gone. They found a moving crew instead of me, a young couple's furniture going in where mine had gone out, and a realty sign with a bold red Solge banner staked into the frost-covered lawn where my mailbox used to stand. Frank told me later he watched the whole thing unfold from his own porch across the street, and that Sophie had come out to stand beside him on the steps, watching 4 confused adults get gently escorted off a property that no longer had anything to do with them. Where did he go? She'd apparently asked her grandfather, tugging on his sleeve. Frank told her he wasn't entirely sure himself, which was mostly true. In early February, Warren summoned all 4 of them into his office one final time. They didn't arrive in a luxury SUV. They took a city bus because there was nothing left to drive. He slid a single black folder across the conference table and let them read, in cold black ink, the full number I had quietly poured into their lives over the years. $181,000 for Derek's company, another $84,000 across 2 years of mortgage subsidy for Melissa and Craig, on top of everything spent on the trip itself. Then he told them, plainly, that my remaining estate had been placed into an irrevocable charitable trust, permanently, and that none of them would see another dollar of it, not now, and not after I was gone. Derek left that meeting without a word. I haven't heard from him since. Not once, not even a text message, and some nights that silence sits heavier on me than anything else in this whole story. Melissa was different. That's the part of this I want you to hear all the way through, because I think it matters more than the parts where everything collapsed. She called me for the first time in early March, 3 weeks after that meeting, and I almost didn't answer. When I finally did, she didn't ask for money. She didn't ask me to come back. She said, in a voice I hadn't heard from her since she was a little girl, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to hear your voice." And then she hung up before I could say much of anything back. She called again the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. By April, the calls had become a standing habit, 20 minutes most weeks, sometimes about nothing at all. Her new job at a school district office, the modest apartment she and Craig had moved into after the house finally sold in a short sale, small things, honest things. In May, she started volunteering 2 mornings a week at a food bank near their new place. Not because anyone was watching, but because, as she told me once, almost embarrassed to say it out loud, it was the first time in her adult life she'd done something for someone else that didn't come with an angle attached. She flew down to see me on Sanibel in June, alone, and she cried on my porch for the better part of an hour, before either of us said much of anything real. I didn't hand her forgiveness wrapped up neatly with a bow, because I don't believe forgiveness works that way, not for something this deep. But I let her sit there. I made her a cup of the same cheap coffee I'd been drinking all winter, and we watched the tide come in together. And it was the first honest hour I'd spent with either of my children in longer than I could remember. Before she flew home, I gave her one of the Christmas cards from the little wooden box I'd packed. The last one Eleanor ever wrote her, the winter before she passed, full of her mother's careful, looping handwriting. Melissa read it twice, folded it with both hands like it might crumble, and told me she was going to frame it. I believe her, because months later, that's exactly what she did, and she sends me a photo of it hanging on her wall every single Christmas now, without fail. Frank still comes by most evenings with a couple of beers, and we sit on this porch and watch the water instead of the driveway, which suits me a great deal better these days. And Sophie still visits on Saturdays, though it's a longer drive for Frank's daughter now, all the way down to the Gulf Coast. And she still brings cookies with far too much frosting, and she still tells me long, meandering stories, though the hamster has since been replaced by a slightly less dramatic classroom fish. It was Sophie, actually, this past Christmas Eve, sitting cross-legged on my porch floor with a cookie in each hand, who asked me the question that finally put words to everything I'd spent an entire year trying to understand on my own. She'd overheard some small piece of the story from her grandfather, enough to be curious, and she looked up at me with that same unguarded directness she's had since she was 4 years old, and asked, "Grandpa Walter, if your family didn't want to be around you, why did they still want your money so bad?" I sat with that question a long time before I answered her, turning Eleanor's brass compass over slowly in my hands, the way I still do most evenings on this porch. "Because, sweetheart," I finally told her, "some people mistake being taken care of for actually being loved, and it takes losing everything you were handed to finally learn the difference." She thought about that for a moment, nodded like it made perfect sense to her, and went right back to her cookie, because 8-year-olds have a wonderful way of taking the heaviest truths and simply letting them settle, without needing to carry them around afterward the way the rest of us do. If there is one thing this whole ordeal has taught me, it's that blind generosity, given without limits or consequences, doesn't build gratitude in the people you love. It only teaches them that the floor will always catch them, no matter how far they fall, no matter how little they've earned the landing. Real love sometimes means closing your hand around what you have and letting the people you cherish stand on their own 2 feet, even when it breaks your heart to watch them stumble first. You cannot buy your way into being truly seen by people who only ever valued the account behind your name, and you can never fill a kind of greed that was never built with a bottom to begin with. If this story found something true in you today, tell me where you're watching from down in the comments below. And if you've ever had to close your hand around what was yours to protect the people who never once said thank you for it, hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this one still to come.